So again, my talk is called Christine de Pizan through story maps. And so what story maps are is what I'm going to talk about. Just let me open up. Let me see if I can get my screen shared. I think my screen should be shared. Is that, everybody sees that? Okay, great. So Christine de Pizan through story maps. I'm just going to give a little quick introduction about why map. Why do we map things? Like, why do we put things on maps? I'm going to talk a little bit about story mapping, give you a definition and show you some examples, including my own thinking about mapping in Christine de Pizan. I'm going to talk about two platforms very briefly. One's called ArcGIS story maps, and the other one's called storymap.js. These are big mouthfuls of things, right? But I'm going to show you what, and I'm going to give you a little bit of my assessment about why you might use one over the other, and given the interest level and perhaps the kinds of support that you have at your institution. I'm also going to talk with about some tips and some learning outcomes for those story mapping exercises that I'm going to suggest, and then give you some links and resources that will be provided at the Middle Ages for Educators website. So a lot of what I've actually framed my talk with today has been already spoken about by the previous talks. So this idea of doing is learning, right? That we exchange transactional knowledge, transmission-based pedagogy for activity-centered learning. And so one of the things that I'm going to suggest today is that mapping is a student-centered, collaborative, sometimes it could be individual, but very often collaborative, integrative, and exploratory activity. And I think it's one that we can even do remotely. And one of the things that I've noticed about working with well-designed digital materials during COVID and also during the summertime in some research projects with my students is that actually we talked a lot about digital drift, right? But digital can also be, if it's well scaffolded, can actually make people pay more attention and be very careful and be very, very meticulous in their work. So why do we map? Well, we all know probably something about historical GIS. We've seen it in history and archaeology. The upper right-hand corner gives a small map coming from the Map in Gothic France project of cathedrals, right? So we take some aspect of our research, we locate it in real geographic space, and we put it on a map, right? And that map gives us a kind of a heuristic. It's a suggestive gesture towards thinking maybe about new research questions, right? About things, why are things close together? Why are there presences? Why are there absences? Why are there clusters? That kind of thing. So medievalists might want to map something like manuscript provenance, or they might want to map pilgrimage towns, or they might want to map burial sites, or they might want to, and we have lots of examples of these kinds of things. Now, one of the things that's a little bit strange, I think, about the map that we see up there, and everybody always says this to me, is that, well, but medieval things are, so we don't know where they were exactly, and we don't know in time where they were, and we don't really know how names changed, and we don't have medieval maps to put things on the base. And I said, well, that's exactly what, is this a bug or a feature? I actually think that all of these questions are excellent, because what they force us to deal with is kind of navigating or looking at the gap between the present and the past, and to be thinking about the ways that information is represented nowadays, and to be thinking hard and attempting to communicate the past for present audiences. So I have a project that I did way back in 2015, actually, when I met Laura Moriali, and it was at the Fordham Center for Medieval Studies, and I was working on a data set of all the places mentioned in Christine de Pizan. And you can see there's a map address here. There's also a link to the data, which is Creative Commons 0 licensed, which means that you can do whatever you want with it. And there's a companion essay in the MLA teaching volume for teaching Christine de Pizan. So what does a map like this do? Well, a map like this helps us think a little bit about the places that author was mentioning, right? It's a very flat map, though. And what I mean by a flat map is there's not a lot of opportunity, unless you're very trained to read maps, there's not a lot of opportunity to actually dig into it, right? And to tell lots of little stories. There's actually lots of stories there. Like, for example, the green, which you might see, apologies for if anyone has accessibility issues with color, but the green is the Charles V text. And so that is mostly centered on France. Likewise, the Livre de Paix is in the red. It's also mostly centered on France. And these are actually spaces of action, right? Where she's actually mentioning historical moments and things that are happening in real history. But if you look at the blues and you look at the light blues and you look at the dark, in particular the dark navy blue, and that's mostly in the Eastern Mediterranean, what we see is Christine indexing ancient spaces, talking about Mediterranean places, talking about, this is not settings. These are not settings, right? These are actually references made to mythology. And so we can see on a map like this, if we play around with it, and it's designed to be that way, that you can click on a button or one of the points and you get a little bit of information like this one. We're clicking on Macedon. We see that it's in the Col de Policy, and we know that it's an ancient region according to the person who did the coding, myself. So, but this is hard to do. And actually, this is one of the reasons that I do this as a digital humanist, is because it's an open educational resource. So this thing is sitting out there in the world. Anybody can work with it. Anybody can go play with it. Anyone can use it in their teaching. Costs you nothing, work on phone, everything, right? So this is, but to do that for mapping is hard. And the world is not set up to do free mapping. So one of the things I'd like to do is to just explain a little tiny bit about how I got there, right? So basically behind a map is a spreadsheet. Right? It's basically a table. And that table tends to have certain general categories in it. It tends to have a latitude and longitude. And of course, latitudes and longitudes aren't really a depiction of a region, but we use some kind of a center point to make things easy. And so when we have one of these, we can plug it into a mapping program and up comes a map. Now, to make one of these spreadsheets, however, is a lot of work. I mean, it takes a lot of work. And there are ways that you could automate it and do different things with it, but this was a lot of work. But I would like to suggest that something like that is something that's perfect to do in a classroom, especially because what it does is it asks people to work collectively together, and all you would really need is a Google Doc, right, to work on this. Would ask them to be very precise in their decision-making, to come to certain choices, to norm along certain kind of intellectual choices about what is actually happening in any topic, not just Christine de Pizan, any particular topic, whether dealing with a source material, whether dealing with primary materials, whatever. But it actually asks them to work together as a team. And I think that's a really important takeaway, I hope, from my talk today. So story mapping, what is story mapping? Well, story mapping has come about in the last couple of years as a way of visualizing more than just a map, but putting maps and geographic data together with rich multimedia. So it's a bit like making a blog and actually scrolling through, right, a blog in which you move between text, image, video, and maps that help us contextualize the spatial elements of those things that we're writing about. But then I would just add a little bit, is that one of the interesting ways that story maps is moving and is changing is it actually doesn't have to be a map, but we can actually have it be just an image. And so we can move around an image as if it were a map. And this is important because let's say you want to map Game of Thrones. Well, we don't really have a map of Game of Thrones. Well, actually we do, but it's an imaginary one. And so what we don't have real geographic coordinates. What we do is we have little pixels and we mark things. And I have some examples of that, you'll see. So some examples of storytelling, story maps for medieval studies that I found. The first three use Esri or ArcGIS story maps. Some really beautiful ones like the Road to Agincourt, done from Edinburgh, allows us to talk about military history. So what we used to see, if you remember in historical atlases, you would have a map and you would have all these kind of like arrows and and movement in space. We can actually scroll through and have kind of different zoom levels and visualize battles as they take place, put together with text. We have some other ones from art history, a really interesting one about geoarchaeology on London's lost river, the Tyburn, right, which is no longer there. And I really like this one because geoarchaeology is a perfect example of how we want to actually be able to navigate past and present at the same time. The last two ones I put on there for fun, but also are using the storymap.js platform. We have an example of the Garden of Earthly Delights by Bosch. So it's actually just a painting. But imagine that what you can do is you can use a painting like a map, right? And so you can point to different pieces on the screen. And likewise, we'll see the example of the Game of Thrones that I brought up, where you can actually map and talk about that, although it's not really taking place in real space. So storytelling, so in ArcGIS maps, what we end up doing is you make an account, you add a layer. So you could just upload the layer of the Christine de Pizan, of this structured data table. You then, it pulls up a map, and then it starts to ask you, well, how do you want this map to look? Do you want the the kinds of places to be colored differently? Do you want the works to be covered differently? Do you want to make prose texts in red and poetic texts in blue, etc.? And then you import this into this format, which we're going to see in just a minute, of looking at a story map. Now, storymap.js is a little different in the sense that it still combines a map and text, but it doesn't allow you to upload one of those files, upload one of those structured data sheets. So it's a little easier actually for the novice in the sense that what you really have to do, what you use is you use a digital map the way that you would use, let's say, Google Maps. You search for places and then you find exactly the place on the map that you want to drop the pin, and you drop the pin. Right? So it's a little bit, it's not, there's not this pre-step, right, of having to put everything together. So imaginary worlds or manuscript illuminations. I pointed out the Game of Thrones example. I found some examples on Reddit of people who make D&D world maps for themselves, right? These are not real. Or a manuscript that I actually have written about and care a lot about, which is Francais 9087 at the National Library of France, which is actually depicting the fall of Constantinople in 1453, has a distinctly non-geographic or fully geographic representation of the world. But we could imagine writing onto that and telling stories by moving around. So I have some suggestions about why you'd use ArcGIS or Nightlab. I think that Nightlab is an easier entry point. It's also free. We have a free license with the Esri, the ArcGIS, but what you really need there is someone in your institution that has an institutional account to be able to do that. So but anyway, this is your choice. Everyone, you can start with one and move to the other, or go in the opposite direction. But every platform has its own benefits and disadvantages. I included here some design tips for storytelling a lesson, like do it yourself first. Right? This is kind of the backward design idea, like know what you want people to create, right? And then create a structure for your students, a shared space like a Google Drive or something where they can actually work together, scaffold a task board for them, right? So they know this and then this and then this, and sort of walk them through the steps. And it'll be much easier for you to see your students building up. And I have all the way down to one of the things that I really encourage is reflective writing on the process, because reflective writing, especially the kind of reflective writing where you're saying, for example, write a letter to your grandmother and explain to her what a story map is. What you get is you get their language for understanding why what they learned how to do is important and how it fits into their lives and into their future career prospects and all that. Be ready for this to look not like what you expect. So I put some learning objectives, which I'm going to skip in the interest of time, but I gave some learning objectives that might be useful to put in if you wanted to have one of these. And I also have some links and resources. So what I want to do just right now, just in a minute that is left to me, is just to take you into what this actually looks like, right? So designing a story map is like writing a blog, right? You do piece by piece. And what you see here is you see this plus sign. That means add a chunk, right? Just add a block. So I wrote this thing up at the top, Christine de Pizan's oeuvre. I uploaded one of the illuminations from the Queen's manuscript. I put in a little bit of text here. Then I inserted a map that I had from somewhere else. And you can see that this is actually kind of interesting because it's an interactive map, right? And then I could put even some more text, and all of this is customizable. So it's like writing an essay where one's doing research, but one's mobilizing all kinds of other multimedia objects that are the objects of our time, right? And I think it's a really compelling way of working with students. The Christine de Pizan map that works in storymap.js is a little bit different, but basically the same. One goes between edit view and preview. When you're in edit, you're building up along the left-hand side, some slides. And what you can do is you have some material here, which is like your map where you're choosing something. You can put media, you create a title, you can put some text inside, you can put your attributes of all those OERs that you've put in. And basically once you've added a number of these, you create this piece. So it's actually like essay writing in the sense it's like putting together paragraphs, right? And so one is learning as a student to sequence an argument or a narrative using both text and image. And I'm going to stop. Yeah, I didn't. Sorry, I didn't show you the Game of Thrones because, of course, everybody likes a little bit of Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones here, right? And so you can see it's a fake map, but you can move through, right? And then you've got these little screens that show up, and we're zooming in and out and moving on. It's just this kind of activity, I believe, is not only excellent for creating critical skills, in particular in the digital medium, but also just the fact that it has all of this multimedia with it is excellent for teaching correct citation in the digital age, and it's very motivating for students. And so with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.